Hi, everybody. Jamf Nation. How's it going? Oh, good, good. I'm just up here representing Pixar as a systems engineer. I have been here to JNUC 4 times, and I mean, I think that your first JNUC, you never forget that. That's always the most special, probably. But I do think beyond that, it's just been getting better and better. So, round of applause for everybody putting this together. It's been fantastic. And so, yeah, talking about these reverse extension attributes. The presentation agenda is we'll talk about reverse extension attributes, this clever little idea we have for working with data locally, and how it uses what we're calling a host info file to store this data. The benefits of doing something like this, and then some examples of how we're using it in patch management in our environment. And in terms of patch management, this will be talking about macOS patching, and we're not using Jamf patch definitions or patch policies for this at the moment. Certainly that's a valid way to go. We're using Jamf tools, Jamf policies, et cetera, but we're not doing that. And I really want to emphasize an important takeaway for today is, this is not a deep dive in patch. It's not going to solve all your problems, but hopefully some of these concepts might percolate into some ideas for you. And so we'll be talking about the API a little bit. It's also not a deep dive in the API, but it is, it's part of what we're talking about here. Hopefully you know that the API has gone through changes lately. It is continuing to go through changes. What was once called the Universal API, which was released or sort of made public a year or two ago, I actually don't know, is now called the Jamf Pro API. And that is still a beta product. It's a complete rewriting of the API, and so it's a big process to get through that. Meanwhile, the classic API is the previously existing API that we all have used for years. JSON versus XML. So the new Jamf Pro API is going to focus on using JSON as the sort of first-class citizen of data types. And meanwhile, the classic API would allow both JSON and XML. JSON is the future, and the Universal or Jamf Pro API is the future. But for my examples today, when I'm showing code and everything, we're using the classic API with XML. And so I think that a lot of Jamf Pro admins might be more familiar with that from copying and pasting from GitHub or from their Jamf courses, those kinds of things. But we do all need to adapt. And so that gives me an opportunity to plug Ruby.jss. Ruby.jss is a framework, a library that acts as a sort of a wrapper around the Jamf Pro API, or I guess the classic API, and then in the future, the Jamf Pro API. It's a great, great tool written by my colleague Chris Lascelles here in the front row, and also contributed to by Arika Hayes, also in the front row. And there's a lot to it. It's just a wonderful tool if you have any inkling of using the API in a really robust way. Even if you're allergic to Ruby, I highly recommend checking it out. Because it's not like you need to be a really sophisticated Ruby programmer to use it in some casual ways. So, extension attributes. I mean, as we all know, macOS extension attributes in Jamf are custom fields to collect almost any piece of attribute data from a computer. I think that's verbatim from documentation, or at least really close to it. So that's pretty straightforward. And they can be populated in several ways. We can manually enter data in the Jamf UI. We could have a drop-down menu or pipe some data in or map it to LDAP attributes. But for today, we're focusing on the output of scripts for our extension attributes. And so script output, in this case, is gathered from computer and saved to Jamf Pro during the computer's recon. Reverse extension attributes, very similar to traditional extension attributes. You may notice that this is the exact same bullet point as the previous slide. And the difference is the direction of travel of the data. So the data is gathered from Jamf Pro and saved to the computer during execution. But wait, there's more. I did name this reverse extension attributes, I guess trying to be clever. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but probably a more accurate title is local extension attributes. And the reason for that is that the data does not have to come from Jamf. It's just data. You could store important LDAP attributes in your host info file, as we do. You could talk to any other identity provider with the API and get information from there. Anywhere you're getting data from, including the computer itself, can store data locally. Jamf extension attributes accept strings, integers, and dates as data types, which allows for some great functionality with things like smart groups and doing compares of dates, being allowed to check for things that occurred before or after a certain date, or doing calculations based on integers. For reverse extension attributes, we got the same thing going on, except we also could potentially be using Boolean or floating point data types. And if any of those sound familiar, it's probably because you have used probably some tool to manipulate a plist in the past. Oftentimes that's defaults. So if you aren't that familiar, but maybe you've sort of just dabbled in using command line tools to execute things, you may have gone to Google or something and found a defaults command to set a user setting or do something, and it's defaults and then writing to the path of the domain you're talking about, and or the direct plist, and the key and the value. And so we are using a host info file as a plist. We call ours com.pixar.hostinfo.plist. It's stored in a custom admin folder that we have tucked away on each file on each computer. It's the kind of place where we store locally quick add if we ever need to re-enroll a machine, and some other things are in there. And it lives there. And standard plist tools can work with it because it is a standard plist. Defaults, plist buddy, Python or Ruby libraries that interact with plist could do the same. So a big part of doing this is convenience. And so we purposefully, I've been struggling with that word all day, purposefully kept this simple. We are keeping this plist that we're using for our host info file as simple XML keys and values. We're not using any complicated data structures like arrays. Certainly, plists can support that, and I think that this could be implemented in a way that did, but we have not done so because it would be overly burdensome for our needs. Excuse me. But having said all that, I do have a good example of a place you may want to use an array or some more complicated data structure, and that'd be to store locally a list of the computer groups that your client is a member of. And this is actually something we do. We've done this for years using the API to daily cache a list of every group that the computer is a member of, just in a list, just a simple text file, because that's all we needed and it worked. In hindsight, or I should say, nowadays we may have added it to reverse extension attributes, and we may still, but at the moment that's not how it is. But having that just as an example, as a tool to do some sort of more extended scoping, you can imagine maybe having a policy that's scoped to all your laptops, and it runs once per day or whatever, and the script it runs could then query this file and determine, oh, am I in this group, which could be defined in whatever way it is, and then decide to whether it runs or exits or does something different based on that, without needing that script to query the API itself. Okay, this is a screenshot of terminal. I guess it's probably pretty readable. I was a little wondering about that. If it's not in the back, it's an output of plist buddy doing the print command on the host info file, which in this case I've just defined as being in the etc folder. And it's a simple plist with these several things. Some of these items are coming from Jamf Pro. And so the first one there, Pixar function, is a custom extension attribute we have with several values. By far the most common is workstation. And this one, of course, is a workstation. Another value that could be there might be Server or Avid or Pro Tools, and they get scoped and handled differently accordingly. Then 3 lower are prepended by Jamf OS, or I should say just Jamf, and then the first being Jamf OS build, and that's the known OS build of this computer from Jamf Pro, cached locally. And we'll get to that a little bit later about why that's helpful. The Jamf Computer ID, which is the number, the unique identifier of your computer in Jamf Pro, and then the username assigned, in this case it's Buzz, for the computer. These items come from LDAP. We are using a regularly occurring script to cache all of this data, and some of it reaches out to Jamf Pro for it, and some of it reaches out to LDAP. We need to keep our host names as the defined source of truth in LDAP for DNS purposes, and so that's why we're focused on that. And we're using mobile accounts, unfortunately, and the UID of that mobile account is cached as well for convenience. And then these are just generated locally from the computer. We have the Pixarified date, so that's an actual date object, a timestamp that is the output of the completion of a script, or Pixarify script. Pixarify is basically our first boot script, if you're familiar with that. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the examples. And then Luxified, similar in concept to Pixarified. This is, though, not a... Oh, I skipped screensaver. Screensaver being just the integer value of the number of seconds that the username of this computer is set to. So this would be 3,600 seconds an hour. Luxified at the bottom would be the date, or the OS version that was present at the time that Luxify script ran. Talk about that more later, too. OK, so that's a quick tour. We've seen sort of what a host info file looks like, but why are we doing this? What's the benefits of doing this? The first I'll talk about a little bit is data visibility. So you can quickly see this relevant data from the command line. It's obviously, your imagination is your only limitation as to what you could put in your file. But you can imagine maybe being SSH'd into a remote host as an administrator and just wanting a quick rundown of several bullet points of information before you even start talking to the user or addressing the issue you're there to do. So again, here's the same screenshot, and you're SSH'd in. You run, in this case, your plistbuddy command. It's the rawest sort of format of output you could see this in. But as a sort of proof of concept, you can see how you can get this quick data. And if your environment doesn't use SSH, remote access, or you're more, you're a help desk kind of administrator, or you're actually the user, it could be pretty trivial to wrap a simple skin with Jamf Helper or Cocoa Dialog or several other options to show up some kind of display that would give information that that user could then pass on to your help desk. And more so, I think that the value here is in a lot of just sort of more power, flexibility, control, and convenience. By having fewer API calls and in getting those entries locally, you're doing less server and network load. You can have access to these items for offline availability. You could have non-Jamf tasks like custom launch daemons that could read or write this data without Jamf itself. And ultimately, Jamf or otherwise, your scripts can be made simpler and more standardized, which could be valuable both for you, maybe as an engineer or sysadmin, but also for maybe your frontline techs, your entry-level staff who want to maybe get into the idea of automating or get into the idea of simple command line access for data, and that could be a really easy starting off point. OK, so a couple examples. Who in here has taken Jamf 300 course? Good. Oh, that's a lot of hands. Jamf education's doing well, I guess. I took mine just in August and had a good time. I learned a lot and enjoyed my professor as well as the class. So anyway, in my class, and probably yours, we had a task to use the API to change the site of a computer with its Jamf ID. Well, if you don't have the Jamf ID, you need to get it. And so to do so, we would use the serial number, defining that here as a variable based on the output of System Profiler. We can then use that serial number to query the Jamf API, the classic API, as I mentioned before. And so here, using a variable Jamf ID to set with the curl command some credentials, username, password, and deep down in that is the serial number that is going to gather the Jamf ID. So then you have the Jamf ID, and the goal again is to change the site of a computer with that Jamf ID. So then we're going to do another curl command. This is a put command that's putting data up there, that's changing the site to, in this case, Monstropolis. So that's fine. I think that was a good lesson. It's very informative in a classroom setting. I would say, though, best practices would be to have fewer API calls. And so if you have this Jamf ID cached locally, you can then use it for this. The same task is basically these two steps. We're defining here the path to your file and your Jamf ID based on the output of, in this case, defaults, not plist buddy. Defaults read the path. The Jamf Computer ID is the key. And then you get that information will be probably in our case, a 4-digit number. Then we have that as the variable. We're then using that with curl. This is the exact same final line of the previous slide. So one fewer API call, one fewer times to authenticate, that many fewer cycles on your CPU of your server. And that doesn't mean much in this example, but over time, if you add it up, if you have a large fleet, if you're doing a lot with the API and scripts, that would potentially add up and simplify to do this way. And so we've been reading from the API with defaults and plist buddy, and we can write to the API, to your host info file with the same kinds of tools. Let's say in this case, we want to cache that Jamf user to your host info file. In the previous example, that was Buzz. We would, as an example, use a Jamf Pro policy running daily, once per day, checking it at the check-in trigger. And the payload would be a script. And that script would use the API to query the server for the assigned Jamf username and write it to the file. That is the structure of the policy. You could tweak it as needed. And the structure of the script that's within it, which probably in real world would be doing other things, maybe caching other things, but just for this example, it would simply be like, hey, we got to ask Jamf Pro who is the user of this computer. So we're defining the path to our host info file. We're using a serial number as a unique identifier to query the API. We are then assigning this Jamf user variable based on the curl output using serial number to do it. And we then have the Jamf user. We're using defaults write to the file path. The Jamf username is the key. It is a string, and the Jamf user is the variable that is coming from the API. Another example, the Pixarification timestamp I mentioned. Again, it's the output of the date command, and it's the endpoint of when our first boot script runs. You can imagine wanting a number of configuration things to happen at the first boot up of a computer, so it's configured for your environment. So here, again, defining the path to your plist, and then it's just a simple default write, because that is encapsulating the output of the date command at the end there as its own. That becomes a date object with that -date flag as the key. And so this is helpful. You can imagine this is the end of a longer script that's doing other stuff. And this is helpful because you have it locally, and that's cool. But really, what we're also then doing is piping this up as a proper Jamf Pro extension attribute, which we can then use for querying, running reports of when various builds were happening, That becomes very valuable when the frontline techs will realize, oh, I'm consistently seeing these problems with these recent build outs, and so let's track down back to when this started and with reports from the I almost said the JSS. I guess I did. From Jamf Pro. There was talk of a swear jar in a previous session. I like that. Yeah, so having that information can help us track down, oh, when was this change to the build-out process made, and allow us to hopefully resolve it. So, little history lesson. It's going to be a bit of a tangent, but I think I'm going to circle back around just right. Puppy time. Besides my colleagues up front, does anyone know about puppy time? Ooh, good, some hands. Puppy time was probably the most popular thing ever talked about by my colleague Chris at previous presentations. He's spoken at, was it 4 JNUCs? 5 in the past. So he's paid his dues, and I'm up here this time. But the puppy time is what we used for slideshow while macOS updates were occurring for our users. And so just, a bit of the workflow would be, this is years ago, 10 years ago or whatever. Users would get an email notifying them that, hey, it's puppy time, and please log out for your updates. When they did, they saw they had puppy time, and they had a slideshow of cute puppies that would rotate as they watched, or they watched that while in the background the installer ran. And it was pretty popular. There were even employees who submitted their puppies for the slideshow. Yeah, so that was great. And I will say that in some ways, well, I'm going to get to this in a moment. Apple made some changes at 10.13, where now the OS updaters run in their own installer environment, and so we no longer have any kind of hooks while these updaters are running in the console session. So we can't put up a slideshow of puppies while you're installing 10.13.6 updater. And so in that way, the puppies are dead and sad. Sad for that. But long live the puppies, because number one, they are still, the idea of puppy time is still a component of D3, which is a open source tool that I'll talk about a little briefly later, and for use when you are doing just a standard package installation with D3. They just aren't available for macOS updates. In addition, we are fortunate enough at Pixar to have a very large repository, amount of great intellectual property for our user messaging. And so we get to have a lot of fun when we need to get the attention of our users. We are no longer using emails because it is 2018, and we, in the beginning, are using Notification Center. So when a new update is available, and I apologize, it's probably pretty small, but this update, this notification is coming from the tool Yo. We're using that to pop that up there. It allows you to brand it. We have our little Luxo ball there. And it just says macOS update pending, hi buzz, please run the software update policy in self-service. And you can choose later or now, and now open self-service, and away you go. So this is the first nag. We call it nagging. I'm sure there are others who do that. 7 days. This is happening daily for 7 days. You get, a number of people to update over that time. But after 7 days, if you haven't, well, it's going to get a little more, in your face. And this is where, of course, we're using sadness, a little bit of heartstrings being pulled. And, hey, Buzz, this important update is awaiting installation. macOS update combo 10.13.6. It has been pending since, and a timestamp. And then please run software update. So it's basically the same message. Of course, this is a Jamf helper message, not a Yo notification. And we do that for another 7 days. And people continue to, update and update, but not everybody. And so now, 7 days later, it's time for the cone of shame. So now we're 2 weeks into this thing, and some number of people still haven't updated. So now, not only are we trying to shame them, we're also running this pop-up 4 times per day. during work hours. It's all set up with its own launch statement on a schedule. So that's pretty good, but we still have people that don't do it. So we get a little angry and get some attention that way. You may notice the thing that changed there too is that there's no longer a later button. You cannot exit this dialog without saying now. And we're not at the point yet where that would actually install the update. Culturally, I think that would just not go over well yet. I know that Jamf patch policies can do that, and with a sort of final deadline. It's a thing we think about and talk about, but we're not there yet. But anyway, after all that rambling, let's go back to talking about reverse extension attributes. So these 3 items in this dialog are dynamically generated when the script runs that is doing the nag. So first is hi buzz. Buzz is the active console user. The second one is the macOS update combo. That's the string that is the package that's waiting to be installed. We're using combo updaters. So they apply to all necessary releases or existing flavors of previous OS. And that is coming, in our case, from your host info file, because that was written to the file when that package was cached. We have a caching policy that runs, and at the end has a Postflight script that will write a couple items into the to the host info file. And the second item is even more valuable in a way because it is the timestamp as a date object that can be used and is used for these notifications. So we know when it was cached, so has it been less than a week? OK, well then we can just do one of those yo notifications. If it's more, we're going to do a Jamf helper one. And we'll rotate through the art and change the other options as relevant. So revisiting that whole idea of how the macOS installer environment changed with 10.13. When we had puppy time in the past, we finished off the whole installation with a Postflight script. And that was running because we're in this active console session. This was invisible to the user because they were just watching puppies. But in the background, a script is running that is doing some things. It's a little bit like a first boot light script. Oh, no, it is not a little bit like a first boot light script. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's not what I wanted to say there. So sorry. But we have this great iconic branding lamp. It's our Luxo lamp. And little Pixar trivia. The iconic Luxo lamp is named, or is part of our branding, is our logo because of the short film Luxo Jr. Way back in 1986, was made for actually SIGGRAPH, the effects and computer graphics event, and was displayed there and got a standing ovation even before it was completed, before it finished running. Received the Oscar for Best Animated Short, and was just months after Steve Jobs paid George Lucas $5 million for Pixar. So it's a huge part of our identity and sort of who we are. So we decided that's going to be part of what we're going to use in our terminology for these scripts. Just like we had Pixarification, we had Luxification. And so I've sort of jumped in places. Obviously, I have here first boot light, which is what I said earlier. And because we can no longer run this Postflight script during the actual or after the actual install, because of the installer environment, we're running Luxify at every single startup. And it is like a first boot light. It lets us do things that, certainly not as much as Pixarify, which is first boot, but as a whole number of things that Apple resets that we want to reset, or at the very least run a recon immediately at boot up so that the Jamf Pro server knows about the update that just happened. And there are several other things. We also will, because it's running at every startup, do additional checks about OS, and if it's a major upgrade, then the upgrade will get even more happening in that Luxify script. So it's based on an extension attribute, and the reason it can work this way is because at every startup, it's querying this file and wondering, what's my Jamf OS build? And 99% of the time, a whole bunch of percent of the time, it's the same. The Jamf OS build that was cached is the same as what the OS is running, and so there's nothing to do, and Luxify just exits, and so it's very harmless to any user activity. But there are those times it has updated, does the check. If it doesn't match, well, then Luxify gets to run. And run it does, and our post-flight happens at startup. So with respect, as a Jamf and Mac Apple systems engineer at the other Steve Jobs company, I say one more thing. And we realized after a while of using these tools, defaults and plist buddy, when we were manipulating this host info file, that of course they work and they're successful, but they're a little difficult to work with for this single purpose thing. So we wrote a tool that is called Phi. Phi wraps around your plist host info, it wraps around plist buddy to interact with your host info file. It is very simple. It's single purpose. It just works with this one file. It just works with the simple kinds of data types I talked about, keys and values with no arrays. And it is open sourced by us as a tiny little part of D3, which is what I mentioned earlier. D3 is it's a package deployment and a patch management system of its own, but it's for any Jamf Pro packages, basically. And nowadays, we're not really actually using it for macOS patching. It's a great tool as well. It's built upon Ruby JSS, also written by Chris Lascelles. It is D3. And if you are looking for a patch management solution and you're comfortable with Ruby and you have an on-prem JSS, Jamf Pro server, then you might want to look into this. But regardless of that, you can go to download just Phi and use it independently of D3 and have fun with that. And so here's those links again. I'll just leave these up. These are, the top one is D3. Lower is it's a long URL, and but you can tell where it's truncated, and you could follow the breadcrumbs to get there. And then Ruby JSS, and please go vote. Any questions? Yeah, that's all I got, but yeah, questions if you have them.
Yeah, if anyone has questions around this, we do have a microphone right up here. So if anyone would like more information around this workflow or around the potential for this workflow, please come up to the mic. Some people are walking the opposite direction. Maybe they're confused or they genuinely want to exit. But either way, thank you so much, Dan. That was a really pretty incredible workflow and some interesting ways to leverage that. I was looking at the Jamf Buddy notification, wondering how we were going to get that information quickly and dynamically out every single time without doing a ton of extra work, building extra policies and all that to customize it. That makes sense. Okay. Oh, excellent. We have somebody coming up for a question.
Is this, so one thing that we run into a lot, and I assume this is probably something people in the room run into, is the policies run once and don't have any feedback whether they're successful or not, and then they don't run again. So could you use this to write some sort of a stamp at the end of a policy running, and then you can check for that, and then run it again?
We have logging that goes to a different file where we'll have output, with errors or not. And then there's always the output in the Jamf Pro UI itself for individual policies. So I'm not sure quite what you mean, to be honest.
Okay, so some of the policies that get pushed out, our engineers have had issues with. They don't run, like Jamf thinks that they executed because they don't.
Oh, so
they don't try to run again.
They're pending? Like, is the computer still pending forever, even though it's
either it failed or something else on the computer was bad, so we could then check for that stamp in this file to see if
Yes.
it finished.
I think that in best practices would be probably to not have once per computer scoping, or I should say frequency, and instead try and have ongoing, which then, depending on what you're doing, that may or may not be possible, but then that ongoing script could then query something like this to see if like, oh, I really do need to run or I don't need to run. And that way, if it's just going to happen once and it failed and it's never going to happen again, someone has to go manually go tweak something to make it happen again. I don't know if that answers your question.
Because my thought process is this could then nag people, hey, do this thing again, go to self-service and run this thing because it didn't run.
Okay. Yeah, that would totally work. Yeah,
Right.
it would be like output the fail to to this file.
Yeah.
And then a
Saving
different
a visit to the help
remediation
desk,
thing would
basically.
read that, and it wouldn't all happen immediately probably, but it would
Yeah.
get there.
And I think another classic example of that local level of information, which isn't directly reverse extension attributes, would just be the dummy receipt workflow, like the old classic. You deposit a dummy receipt and you're scoping and you're actually looking for that, possibly in a smart group. Obviously, that's a lot of overhead for a lot of your policies, but that's one other way to track that. Have your script deposit a dummy receipt or put information into the host file, and then base scoping off of that information on a follow-up. But yeah, I agree, not to run once.
I mean, that was what was important to me, I think, about talking about this, is less about this specific idea of this host info file or whatever, and just working locally, using things locally to, change how you work. Hi.
Hi, you gave some good examples of how you're using this right now. Is there anything that you can think of or can share about what you would like to do but you haven't been able to accomplish yet?
I mean, that's a good question. We have things that are bugging us about things like secure token.
Sorry, I should be more specific. I should be regarding this particular tool.
And specifically with the patching part of
Maybe
it?
not with patching, but I can't think of any examples, which is why I'm asking, I
Okay.
suppose. But there's a lot of times where I'm creating a tool and I think, okay, I'm using it for this, but you know what, I bet you I could use it for this, but when I get 100 extra hours, I can go ahead and try to tackle that. Just wondering if there's anything, long distance that you've thought about but haven't been able to accomplish.
I mean, I think that example of adding support for arrays to do something like those computer groups would be cleaner than what we're doing now. But that's not a huge goal. To be honest, I guess I'm blanking. I don't have, I'm too focused on the moment.
Sure. Thanks. Appreciate
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for the great presentation. Really love what you're doing. We are either doing or in process of building similar things, but I like some of the UX elements you guys have put together. My question, though, is kind of tangential to what you've been talking about. So the D3 I've been looking at for years, and I was curious if the sort of on-prem piece of that is something that is just a requirement because that's what your needs were and you haven't built around that, or would somebody who wants to put in the work and fork the project be able to, in your view, build a cloud-compatible fork of D3?
So I will give a quick answer, and then Chris can support me as needed. But I believe that the on-prem requirements are because of some direct database, an additional table that is put into the database, and you couldn't do that as it is with cloud. I believe Chris is working on implementing D3 in the cloud, but it's a big deal, a big project, and I don't have much more to say on it than that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I really loved the nag notifications that you guys set up, and I was just wondering if you would be willing to post any of that as an example of usage of this host info file.
That's a good idea.
It would be really helpful for me. I would love to use something like that.
I think I'd be happy to. I just probably can't do it with the art. Okay. Hi.
Hi. You mentioned in passing that you're still using mobile accounts. Any of the tools that you're sharing here or you're talking about, is there any requirement or dependency on you using mobile accounts, or are they open whether you're using mobile or local accounts?
Yeah, nothing I talked about here today would be dependent on that. Our mobile account needs stem from our heavy use of NFS in our environment, which is just based on decades of infrastructure.
Okay.
But no, yeah, none of this would need
And then collecting the user data that you're collecting in the host info file.
Yeah.
That all can be collected by Enterprise Connect or Nomad or something like that, and then can be read in the same manner.
I mean, I would assume any piece of data you could get from an API query could be put into this file. I don't have enough experience to say exactly what could come from those.
Okay.
But also, if you're using local accounts, depending on what you're looking for, you might be able to just query locally DSCL and see what's in that database.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And another tangential question, I think, but I'm curious what your beta process looks like as far as how you vet updates, whether you're using a key within your host info to say this is like a guinea pig device or anything like that. Just kind of curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, that's a great question, and maybe that's a good answer for the previous one about what might be coming. We will put, as soon as an update becomes available, we'll put it out there, available in self-service to a sort of subset of our company, and sort of I'll encourage them, this is primarily our systems, our IT department, to download and install that. And we'll poke at it from there. And then at some point, we sort of agree, okay, we're good to go. And this is for macOS updates and for security updates is what I'm talking about here. The upgrade thing, it's a bigger beta animal, as I'm sure you can imagine. But then after we feel comfortable, we'll make it live with these policies, these sets of policies, and these local running nags, and away we go. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering if you do anything to protect this file, since it being deleted or modified by end users might affect your scoping or other data collection. Do you archive or get copies, upload those to your inventory collection, or anything else in case?
It is backed up from just our standard backup software, and it's in a protected sort of hidden folder, but it's not like users can get to it as we have admin rights in our environment. So not much more than that. It hasn't been an issue, but it's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Again.
I was just wondering if you ever considered allowing users to edit the file themselves to opt into programs like, say, a beta software delivery, or maybe they could change their screensaver settings directly in that file itself, and then your policies would read it and then execute.
With screensaver, we let them change their screensaver as is. That is something just kind of a convenient place for us to see that. But I get your point, and I think that I'm not sure if I think that probably some policies that run, I'm blanking a little right now, but I think that probably some policies that run that users initiate, like through self-service, do write to that file in one way or another. And so in terms of beta access, I think that's a conversation that we probably need to have about a more sort of holistic beta process that we could do for these updates. Whether or not it would use this file or not, I'm not sure. It may just be an extension attribute in Jamf Pro, which then becomes one of those groups that you're a member of, your computer's a member of. It's especially since that beta access might be associated with a user and not necessarily a piece of hardware. So, and I will say, I didn't talk about it today because it's barely a thing, but we do have a user level host info file, a user info file that is stored in the user's library. It's in the user's preferences folder. That at this point, we're only doing one thing with it, and that's when our first login script runs at the user's first login, and it sets the dock and the desktop background. Then it writes a key to there that's like first login true. So if that home directory is migrated to another system, that script will see that and not run. So doing more with that might be part of it as well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, I think we're just about out of time here, but Dan, thank you again for presenting. I think this is a fantastic workflow. A hand for Dan here. Excellent first time presenting.